Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, I'm Lisa Gable. Welcome to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Oh, welcome. That's fancy, Lisa. Thank you so much for doing that. Lisa Gable's written a fantastic book called Turnaround. She is Todd Hester is also joining us via co-host. Todd, how would you describe how well-credentialed Lisa is? It's remarkable. It's exceptional. It's just impossible to be as successful and as accomplished as you are, Lisa. Thanks for coming on the show. Todd, say hi to Lisa.
Hi, Lisa. And Pete, you're exactly right. I actually made a futile attempt to summarize Lisa's credentials and experience, and then I simply just gave up.
Well, it's been 40 years, so it's a long time.
Well, Pete, with your AOK, that's a great segue into actual talking about the book. Lisa, for our audience members who haven't come across you before, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of your experience, some of the things that you've done, and how that career led to writing Turnaround?
Absolutely. And thanks for asking me, and thanks for having me today. So my book Turnaround, which you can find on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, at indie bookstores, focuses on my career path, which was unusual. I started my career in the Reagan White House, and I got recruited to come to Intel Corporation by a gentleman, Craig Barrett, who had become the CEO and chairman of the board. My book basically talks about how I incorporated the manufacturing techniques that I learned at Intel with the art of diplomacy that I learned at the White House and the State Department, as I have had the opportunity to be a UN delegate, a U.S. ambassador. I've worked with Fortune 500 CEOs who are trying to accomplish something that people haven't done before. So my background is varied, but the book helps pull it all together.
It really does. One of the things that stuck out to me about the book, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about this, is the human element. I've for various reasons, I've read more than my fair share of organizational books, how to build an organization, run an organization, turn around an organization, so on and so forth. And what I really enjoyed about Turnaround, and I really did enjoy reading the book. There's a real human element to it, whether you're talking about shuttle diplomacy, whether you're talking about keeping your commitments to people, regardless of how trivial you may think that commitment is, building consensus and partnerships and coalitions. There was just a really strong element of that personal connection. Can you talk to us a little bit more about where you got that from and how that ended up in the book?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the things that I've always believed, and I learned this from my father, is the importance of people. People are at the center of everything we do. So one thing about a turnaround is that you are making some very, very tough business decisions because of the economics of the business. The revenue might be not be coming in the way that you hoped, or the cost of doing business may be too high. But as you're making those decisions, you always have to remember the people that are impacted. And so one of the things I talk a great deal about is empathy, ways in which you communicate to people the changes that you are making. Secondarily, is the other thing I talk about is partnerships. It's really important to partner with other people. We try to be lone rangers sometimes. Sometimes we have our hero complex. We try to come in and save the day. Other times we are perhaps not recognizing that there are a number of people whose interests align with ours. And so the degree to which we can partner with others, focus on what we do better than other people, identify those people whose interest in their spending is aligned with our goals and objectives. It's just so much more fun to do it with other people.
Do you know James Rosebush? He was in the Reagan White House as well. He's been on the show before.
I do not know him.
Oh, he's a great guy. We'll not talk about him then. Okay. So I want to ask you about anytime I hear empathy, and we've fallen in love with the idea of empathy, and I'm empathetic and I'm an
It is. And it sounded like he was kind of going in the direction of it. It's a word that gets tossed around a lot.
Yeah.
Without maybe knowing kind of how that works. Yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the things I talk about is shuttle diplomacy. You may have people who don't necessarily agree with you politically. And Ronald Reagan used to refer to it as the 80-20 rule. He had the 80-20 rule, which is that if you agreed with somebody 80% of the time, you could still do business with them. I've adjusted that. I've adjusted it down to the 60-40 rule. And here's why. We are stuck right now, and life is very, very complex. And we are very divided, sometimes both in business, sometimes in politics, about what it is that each of us believe. But fundamentally, I actually don't believe they're all bad people in the world. I believe that people have reasons why they believe what they do. And so one of the elements of my book, which I think does make it distinguishable, is I talk a lot about shuttle diplomacy. You need to go and meet with people and meet with them in person, meet with them via Zoom. Listen to what it is that they have to say. Listen to why they believe, what they think is going on. Present an alternative viewpoint. Recognize and acknowledge that they have a different viewpoint than you do, but then identify the places where you agree. And my dad really reached across the aisle. My dad fell into one side of the political equation, but one of the things he did is he just acknowledged a person had a viewpoint. And I think today we kind of shut people out, we shut them down. And I do believe that in order for us to solve the problems in the complex environment in which we have to operate, that we should spend some time doing shuttle diplomacy, listening to others, incorporating what they're saying, showing them how you're actually responding to them. Perhaps you're doing it in a different way than they anticipated, but at the same time, you can acknowledge that you have taken a particular action, and these are the ways it may solve the problem that they've identified.
I'm back.
Okay, we answered your question, Pete, so we hope you like it.
Okay, good. So it was so exciting. Did you guys talk about culture at all?
We did not talk about culture.
Okay, this is what I want to ask you about. I know I was kind of long-winded with my question, but we often can have multiple paths to the same answer, but you have to be culturally strong to be able to see that, hey, this path over here will actually allow us to accomplish our goal. We don't have to create this new cultural path. I would say that culture is a superset of empathy. Empathy kind of falls below it. So, I mean, you got to be empathetic, but you also have to allow an organization to have that culture that it has, and a turnaround that requires a change in culture. It's not a reliable path to that.
Well, one of the things Craig taught me, and I think is so fundamentally important, is he always said, speak with facts. And the reality is, if you can identify things and ways forward that are based on facts, that are based on data, that's really the best way to bring the room to where you want it to be. I recognize that there are many different intonations in what we're discussing. But I do believe that if you, again, spend the time with the individuals, acknowledging their points of view, and then doing so in a fact-based discussion, I've had a lot of success with that. And so it is one thing that I have worked on across the aisle in different ways. Sometimes you can bring results, sometimes you can't, but mutual respect is always critical and part of the process. And we can discuss aspects of culture, but culture does and should be grounded in respect. It should be grounded in fact, and it should be grounded in where the organization needs to go in order to bring about change for its consumers, its customers, its community, whoever it is.
Well, and one of the things that you mentioned in the book, Lisa, is having, for lack of a better phrasing, a future orientation that, you may have to work with this person again some point down the future, or this person may be in a position to help you out at some point in the future. One of the notes that I wrote down was on your section about having to let people go. If you're turning around an organization, that's going to happen. You're going to have to let someone go. And then you give the reader some ideas on how to do that in a productive way, in a way that hopefully keeps a relationship intact. I consider that a degree of empathy. That is an empathetic move.
It is, because part of what I talk about in the book is that the economics of the business, the structure of the business that has to do with revenue and cost, which is essentially all organizations. It doesn't matter if you're the head of a church, if you're the head of a nonprofit, a school, or a Fortune 500 company. Everything has a cost, and everything has to have a mechanism to pay for that cost. Right. And so that structure may not be in a bad position because of the individual that you have to let go. And they're at the, they just happen to be timing wise at a place that perhaps their business unit is no longer going to work within the future that you've outlined for the company. Perhaps the job that they have is no longer applicable to the jobs that you need to produce. You might have identified ways that you attempted to go through a retraining process with that individual. But again, it may be that the retraining, even as you are doing it, is not going to align with the long-term future of the organization. So being able to acknowledge that, being able to have a conversation with them, and there is nothing that prohibits you from writing a letter of recommendation and opening a door for that individual, a good individual, towards their next job. It's just business. And so being able to help them find their next place, what you may find out is I talk a lot about partnerships. You may be actually able to place them in a job where they become a future partner. So you're going to see these people again. I've been around for a long time, since the Reagan administration. So I keep running into people, not only in the United States. I'll be walking down a hallway in Munich, Germany, or in Hong Kong, and I run into somebody. So be nice.
It's simple, and yet it's incredibly complicated at the same time. Just be nice. Just be nice.
Can I add an element to that be nice part? Because
you're fire away.
You're in an airport and you're like, well, there goes so-and-so. And when they turn to you and they say, Lisa, you said something to me once. If you've been genuine, if you've been authentic, if you've been honest with yourself and who you are, the next thing out of their mouth is not going to be like, I'm worried what they're going to say. Like, they're going to say something that empowered you. I'm sure you've had experiences where someone says, oh my God, Lisa, you said this to me one time. What are some of those examples of the future self talking, getting this reward of your candor, of your policy of the shuttle process of including people, but also being genuine?
Well, I have run into people who later on, maybe they weren't so happy with me when they left an organization, but I've run into them later on, and they will tell me that a door that I opened up for them, or a comment that I made about a place that I saw as a future opportunity for them, was on target. And I do a lot of mentoring, and I know that you all do too. It's always a pleasure when I've run into the parents and mentors. I was at a black tie event in Washington right before the shutdown, and a man got up from his table and he came over and he said, I just wanted to let you know, because you were willing to talk to my daughter at this point in time, you may not have realized it, but due to the contact that you made, she is now in this field, and this is where she's at. And so it was a young woman who I had met and arranged for her to talk to someone on Capitol Hill. She later became a member of the State Department Nuclear Deterrence Task Force. What an exciting thing that, an introduction that I'd made gave her those ideas. And I talked to her about her graduate work and talked to her about what she might focus on. Yeah. When you're going through a moment, it's not apparent to you and it's not apparent to the next person. And it's a point of great frustration. And so you may not be perfect in the moment, but if you are genuine with the individual, I have had instances where people have come back and actually thanked me or acknowledged that conversation we had was tough, but it led to a wonderful new opportunity in their lives.
Well, let's talk about one of your biggest mentors, if not your biggest mentor, because it really comes through in the book how much you both love and respected your father.
I did.
Tell us a little bit about him.
So my father was an individual who had great humility, and yet he was a very wise person. He was a very wise soul. He had been one of 7 children. His siblings were 13 to 20 years older than he was. And so his father, during World War II, after his mother passed away when he was 7, sent him off to boarding school in Canada. And so my father basically raised himself. He was just shuttled from different boarding schools to boarding schools, both during the war and then after the war. And so he had to figure out his own way. And it taught him one thing that I thought was particularly exceptional, which is it taught him to not look at the new shiny penny. Don't look at the person who is the most popular person. And, we've all been there where that person comes in and they're just so amazing and they have all the perfect background. What my dad did is he focused on individuals and really digging in to understand what was unique about them, what characteristic was unique about them. He didn't focus on the negatives, he focused on the positives. And what he was able to do is through his mentoring, help them draw out that thing that made them special, that made them exceptional, and then then provide them with the mentoring and the tools to basically course correct over the way in which they presented themselves or the way in which they were managing relationships with others, because he himself knew that you don't always have that training. You don't always have that opportunity. And my dad was able to build an institution for a very small institution to a very, very large institution that now has 7,500 people in it. And as he passed away 2.5 years ago, I found a letter. And this letter shows up in my book because it's the end of the preface. And what it talks about is a letter my dad sent to me when I was a middle manager at Intel Corporation. And there's nothing worse than being a middle manager at a Fortune 500, because you're not young enough that they feel sorry for you, and you're not old enough where you actually have all the answers. You're just stuck there in the middle. And he said, basically the summary of his note was that the biggest stumbling, he said, challenge your crisis. His whole point was challenge your crisis. The biggest stumbling blocks I ever encountered actually ended up being my biggest stepping stones. And that has been the case over and over and over again in my life. And it's the case in a lot of people's lives. We zig and zag through life. Doors open, doors close. We're in the hallway. The hallway's not always the nicest place to be, but we can't anticipate always where our life is meant to go. And so focusing on challenging your crisis, understanding it, what can you do in the future? Those are things my dad taught me. And it's actually what inspired me to write the book is both the letters I received and the phone calls from people he had mentored, men and women, in addition to finding that letter.
When I read your book, I found myself thinking, I wish I had met this guy.
Yeah.
This guy sounds awesome. I really wish I'd had the chance to meet him. One of the things that I wrote down, and it probably is a corollary to our discussion about empathy, is a word that you use to describe your father as a man who has humility.
Yeah.
And in the book, when you're talking about some real potential obstacles or failures to watch out for, you talk about folks that let their ego trip them up and get in the way. Is humility something that you learned from your dad? Does it come from your faith? Did a mentor at Intel say, Lisa, you simply must be more humble? Where did that come from?
I think it did come from my dad. And part of it is you can't be all things to all people, and you can't always be the smartest person in the room. And what I mean by that is we each have unique talents. We each have academic backgrounds. We each have studied different things. We have risen to life through different paths. There's some people who aren't comfortable acknowledging that they don't know what's going on. And maybe it is because of my dad, but I was always willing to raise my hand and go, I don't understand. I currently run a medical research foundation. We do transformational research, clinical trials. Trust me, I'll sit through these meetings, and sometimes I don't understand 75% of what they're talking about. I know what I'm talking about, but I don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
They're MDs, they're PhDs, they're researchers, and so don't be embarrassed to raise your hand and say you don't understand. Don't be embarrassed to find someone after the meeting. And as an adult, we need mentors too. And I think people think that there's this point where I've risen to this level, I can't possibly need a mentor. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't know how certain aspects of social media work. Sometimes I find myself being mentored by the 25-year-old in my office. I'm like, just help me figure this out.
Right.
I don't understand it. What works in this platform? So being willing to just acknowledge that you don't know is a huge relief, because guess what? Other people in the room all of a sudden going, I didn't understand either.
Right.
And it's just being that first person to have that conversation.
One thing that stuck out to me when I was reading that section on leaders and egos is that if you think you've already arrived, if you think you've got all the answers, if you think you no longer need a mentor, you are by definition cutting yourself from any more additional growth.
You are.
You can't grow past that point. And if you can't grow past that point, the people around you are going to have a harder time growing. The organization is going to have a harder time growing. That there's a stagnation that sits in when the ego kicks in. And so I was when I was reading your book, I was actually thinking that in a way that may sound a little counterintuitive to your contemporary American, humility is actually a pathway to more growth. I'm not sure that we have an overabundance of humility in our current cultural situation.
No.
It'd be nice probably if we had a little bit more of that. But it struck me that, I mean, I'm a theologian, so obviously I'm going to say that a virtue like humility is its own good. It's a good in and of itself. But what came out to me in your book is it's pragmatic too. I mean, there's a pragmatic aspect to, brought up empathy or the virtue of humility, that there's some of these character traits that can be really, really useful on a practical level. And I think that's one of the things that stuck out to me about your book is I haven't read a leader write a book that points that out before.
Well, maybe you haven't had a leader that's been in so many jobs where I literally had no clue what was going on in the room. I mean, think about it. I've been brought in to do turnarounds in business, government, and philanthropy across the auto industry and the high-tech industry and in the State Department, in the Department of Defense. I'm brought in because I know how to ask the questions and to follow the process I outline in my book, and I can gather the right groups of people together and have a talent of identifying who can put their finger in the dike at the time you need that hole plugged. But the reality is, I very rarely know the subject matter that I am walking into. And today, I think one of the reasons I also wanted to write the book is you have this confluence and this merger across so many different industries. It's a very, very exciting time. But we have technology being integrated with pharma, being integrated with biotech, being integrated with the way that food is made. We are going to be seeing mass mergers and acquisitions happen across multiple different industries that would never have worked together 20 years ago. You are not going to know everything that people are talking about in that room. It's just not possible. It doesn't matter how smart you are. And so being willing to say you just don't get it and you just don't understand it, I think is half the battle. And my dad always knew he didn't know everything. He went and he got a lot of degrees, but there were a lot of things that he didn't know. And so he would, even up till his death, he affiliated himself with a group of a club where they explored topics that none of them understood. And they would bring in somebody from quantum computing or somebody from the military, and they'd have them talk about things that they all acknowledged they knew nothing about. And so that continuous growth is so important to all of us.
That's fabulous. I love that idea. I'm part of a businessman's luncheon where we do something similar to that. And it is always rewarding to have, we had a guy just come in 2 weeks ago and talk to us about electrical grids. He's a top engineer with our local power company. And he was just walking us through how an electrical grid works, the patchwork of electrical grids across the United States, the need that we have to harden our electrical grids a little bit more than that. And it was just absolutely fascinating. This is a world that I know zero about, but his willingness to walk us through all of that information was just incredibly rewarding. So that's fantastic that your dad did that.
Yeah. And, that gets into, we talk about dirty jobs, right? I mean, one of the things that we've done is we have not encouraged people to go into jobs where they're going to be a mechanical engineer, perhaps, and work on or electrical engineer, whatever it is. They're not going to take the job where it's fixing something in the highway or fixing your car. There are jobs, these jobs are complex today. The military has always been a great place for people to come get trained as an enlisted personnel, whether it's on a sub or a ship. They learn new technology. And the reality is they know how to fix things that we don't know how to fix. They know how things work that we don't know how they work. And so society has sort of come up with this winners and losers framework. And the reality is, the deep respect that you have for any individual who knows how to do something you don't know how to do is so important, because the reality is we don't know how to do it, so we should not talk down to somebody else. Carly Fiorina tells a great story about when she used to wander around the halls of Hewlett Packard, and when she sat down with this guy, she says CEO, he was very low level in the organization, and she asked him what he thought she should do to fix a particular problem. He'd been dying for someone to ask him the question. He had the file and he whips it out and he says, this is what you guys need to do. You guys are all trying to fix it up here. And this is the underlying cause of our problem. And she'll tell the story how she would check in with him and she saved hundreds of millions of dollars because she just went out and asked him. And so walking the floors, being willing to talk to everybody in your organization, not just keeping that closed C-suite environment is really important.
How often do you think that happens, actually? How often do you think those leaders actually get out and walk in the hallways of their corporation and get out of that bubble?
It depends on the leader. I worked in running a self-regulatory initiative for 16 food and beverage CEOs, and it became very apparent very quickly which ones walk the halls and which ones don't walk the halls. Mm-hmm. And I've stayed very close to the hall walkers. And those families, I was just on the telephone with Tim Smucker, who's the chairman of the board of the Smucker Company. They make jelly and they make peanut butter and all sorts of things. They actually make pet food they recently bought. He's a hall walker. And so when I call him up and I'm like, Tim, I want to do this thing on leadership and character. And I just had a sneaky suspicion you had great ideas. He had already gone and pulled out all of his files and sent me, as a matter of fact, I just opened the FedEx because he spends the time, and that family is trained when they come into the company. It's publicly traded, but they're trained to do all the jobs. The Course family, they trained everybody to do all the jobs. It wasn't like you just went straight up to the C-suite. You had to learn how to drive the truck first. And consumer product goods companies go into those little mom and pop stores in Mexico and India, and they're in there talking to people who are making $100 a year and supporting a family of 5 to 10 people. They're their customers. They want to hear how that customer is moving $100 worth of product, because that's actually 45% of the market in some of these developing nations. So it's important. Certain industries understand it, and other ones, maybe they've forgotten.
One of the things I noticed when I was deployed, you'd work at brigade and division levels, all these super high levels. And when I had the opportunity to sit in that room, I could see them screaming at me how they're complete disconnection from the ground truth. I always called it the spaceship. I'm going to go to the spaceship today. And they would say things that you're just like, how in the world can you say this? Like painting a wall of a government center was going to somehow attach people to the government. Like, that's a wonderful and adorable idea, but it's much more complex and hard than that, right? So I got, in that room, in that bubble, even if you walk the halls, you still have to get even further out to find out, like, is this possible? The story I always tell is there was a State Department guy, very high placed, and he kind of wanted to get me. And so he's like, hey, what's their favorite TV channel out there, Pete, in that valley over there? And I was able to say to him, Dennis, there's no electricity in that valley. And so it completely exploded their reality. Not that they couldn't adapt to it, but they needed that shock of someone coming from reality, from the ground, to give them knowledge that they started making assumptions and had no idea they were doing it. And then I learned how to, and you must have this knowledge. I learned how to look at their wall when they communicated and go problem. And these are not hard problems. These are perception problems. They aren't attuned to where the problem is. Does that make sense?
Absolute sense. I mean, one of my favorite movies, our television series, is Band of Brothers. Love that show because it really shows you all that these gentlemen went through as they were fighting each of those battles. And I do believe that, I worked with the military, as you all know, during a very difficult time. And it was when Tailhook had happened. And I don't want to get into Tailhook because that opens up a whole other avenue. But we had half Democrats and half Republicans. Half of us were holdovers into the Clinton administration. And so we didn't agree politically. But what we made a decision to do is I brought up the idea that I was at Intel and we were competing for what's called the Baldrige Award. And it's where you measure the processes of the company and how that company is doing its production and manufacturing. And so this award would be given to some of the best run companies in America. I said, can we just bring in the Baldrige people? So the Baldrige people came in, and we were visiting military bases, and we all agreed that we'd stick to whatever process they told us. We'd try not to politicize what we knew was a very difficult situation. And so they gave us a checklist of questions to ask. And I know I did, and my peers, I did 1,000 interviews
Wow.
where we interviewed men and women at 52 military bases, myself personally, 52 military bases around the world. And then my peers on the committee did the same. And we always made sure that we talked to people at all levels. In fact, we spent 75% of our time talking to enlisted personnel, master sergeants, chief petty officers. We wanted to understand what bothered them. And we came back in a room after these trips, and we had those white sheets hanging on the wall, and we all had written down what we learned. And then we were given the 5 stickies, and the admirals and the generals, and all of us are going around with our 5 stickies. As you may know, what you get to do is you can put all 5 stickies on one thing that you decide has to be the issue that we go after, or you can spread your stickies out. But the reality is you have to rank and rate. You've heard all this stuff. You got to rank and rate what you're going to talk about. And you know what the top thing was? Military housing, back-to-back deployments, not being able to get access to the equipment they needed to fix the airplanes during Kosovo because we were going in so frequently, not being able to get back to their homes. And so you did have more people maybe activating bad habits. People get frustrated. When you get frustrated, sometimes you say things and you do things that you wouldn't normally do if you weren't exhausted. But it put a different prism on it. And as you said, Pete, you get out, you talk to everybody. That's really the only way to solve the problem is you've got to talk to the store owners, the grocery store workers, the truck drivers. You've got to talk to everybody that's in your supply chain.
I could preach the most amazing sermon that would make St. Augustine himself envious, and it would still not get me as far with the congregation as spending time with the parishioner where the parishioner was in the parishioner's world. There's nothing that beats it. There's nothing that beats cultivating that relationship. There's nothing that beats meeting someone where they are and communicating to them that they are worth you getting out of your comfort zone and hanging out with them. Pete, this had to be a life or death matter for you when you were in Afghanistan, is having that skill set of meeting people where they are.
Oh man. This is, and I want to say this because I know that Lisa will have a lot to say about this. 2 of my favorite questions to ask anybody, because I had to balance the military at all of the military nonsense, State Department, all those people, especially people who had Kennedy School of Government degrees because they were horrible at their job. But
I knew that was going to show up somewhere.
And I always have to hit those guys because they don't know that they're the dumbest person in the room. But also with the environment and the people I lived out there. And so I would say, what's your opinion on whatever the topic was? And then I'd also say, what keeps you up at night? And those 2 questions opened up hearts and beautiful stories and tragic stories, and then the simplest problems. Here's what keeps me up at night. I worry about my daughter going to school by herself, whatever it is. And we don't even know which side of the equation I'm talking about. So those were questions that changed how I saw what truly comprised of where the work was. That's the other question I asked myself. Where is the work here? Right. And those were the things. I'll shut up now.
Well, it is so important. And things do keep all of us up at night. There are very few people who don't have those nights at 2:00 in the morning where you're trying to solve a problem. And we see it in the world that I'm in today, which is with patients. And there's something that the FDA brought about during the last few years. And I actually think it is a very important issue for us to focus on. They call it the voice of the patient. And my husband's had cancer off and on for the last 23 years. He has 2 autoimmune diseases. And I was speaking to someone else earlier about he keeps track of everything. He keeps track of how he responds to different drugs. He keeps track of what's going on in his life at different times. He keeps track of things he can't do that he used to be able to do. So that voice of the patient, that understanding what that person's going through, what they tried, what didn't work for them, what worked for them, as you say, within the military, we have such an amazing group of young men and young women who are out there. My nephew is a Marine. He'll be deployed in November of next year. Actually, he's going to be deployed soon. I just realized he's going to be deployed in November. It's been so far off that we've been talking about it as he was going through all of his training. But those young people know, and you want to hear them. And so doing those military interviews was truly one of the biggest life-changing moments of my life, to really understand what they were going through, whether they were at the DMZ, whether or not they were in Europe, whether they were in North Africa, wherever they were.
I had a parishioner tell me one time that when I spent time with him, I made 5 minutes seem like 30. And I said, wait, do you mean that in a complimentary way? and he said, yes, in this case, I actually do mean it like, it feels like it's invested time. You can't beat that. My wife's an ER doctor, and she's also the medical director for emergency medicine of her hospital. And she, I don't think I'm talking out of school here to say, she has a tough time getting her staff to see patients. You're talking about patients advocating for themselves and having a voice, seeing patients as individuals and not as clinical presentations.
It's funny. One of my head of research always refers to people as phenotypes, and I tease him. I go, Bruce, they're people.
Right.
They're like, I never even heard the word, because, well, Lisa, then I'm going to make it more complicated. There's also genotypes. I'm like, they're people. they're people. Something hurts. They had a rash. They had this reaction to the drug, and it is hard. Look, I just, as I've been in this field and as I went through everything with my husband, there's such wonderful people who are in the medical field, and they're trying to do the right thing, but they're overwhelmed. They've got a lot going on right now. They had a lot going on before. I mean, some of the hospitals in California, downtown Washington, D.C., when you think of the quantity of people that they see, be polite, be nice, recognize and acknowledge that they're doing so much.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly right. And even when the issue is of the person's own making, we'll say, there's still a story there. There's still a story behind there that got them to where they are. And that's something that cuts across every that's true in the military. It's true in the philanthropic world. It's true in the ecclesiastical world. People are people, and we're really not all that fundamentally different from one another. There are a lot of people who accentuate the things that do make us different, but we're fundamentally just people.
Yep. And we all get frustrated, right? I mean, it's kind of like, I sobbed during the 9/11 20th anniversary when they reposted the conversations of the people on Flight 93 that went down in Pennsylvania, because I'd never read the entire script. I don't even know if the entire script was out before the 20th anniversary, but people were posting it. And when you look around an airplane, and it's funny, I just came back from California last night. When you look around an airplane and you look at all these people that you have nothing in common with, and you pay attention to the fact that they're talking to the guy 3 seats in front of you about whether or not he's willing to open the door and stand out of the way so the rest of us can go on the raft.
Right.
It brings it down to reality that when bad things happen, it doesn't matter if it's an earthquake, it's a fire, if it's loss, whatever, a car accident. At that point, we are all equal. As Todd, you're the minister, we're all equal in the eyes of God. We're all the same. And we all react differently because we all handle frustration differently. And that's one thing that the book really tries to address. We all handle frustration differently. We do. And there are, I said, everybody during COVID got one freak out moment, because I watched people that were type A personalities that held their organization together. They were the steady eddies. We're all going up the hill. We're just going to keep going up the hill. And you know what? May of this past year was like a freak out moment for a lot of people. They'd absorbed all of the difficulty on behalf of other people. We all get one. And so the question is, what do you do afterwards?
Yeah, part of your book toward the end actually talks about the need for rest, the need for stepping back a little bit. When you talk at the end of the book about planning your exit and what does that exit look like, and you said there are going to be a fair number of people who need to take a break and walk away from this for a little bit. before they start their next project. And we're all beneficiaries, for better or for worse, of the Protestant work ethic, which says that you sort of begrudgingly get a Sabbath, and that's about it.
Yeah.
But everything else is go, 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 go. And I appreciated that you brought out the fact that we're human. We're not robots. We're not machines. We can't just go on forever. You've got to take a break. You've got to recharge the batteries, or else the freak out moment becomes freak out moments,
Yeah.
plural, which isn't good for anybody.
It's not. And, one of the things we tried to do during COVID is we tried to get our teams to take time off, and then they still wouldn't. So what I started doing is just shutting down the office for everybody. I was like, okay, the Friday before Labor Day, we're just shutting it down completely, like literally shutting it down completely. And we're doing that this year between Christmas and New Year's, which we don't normally do, because otherwise they don't stop. If there's another person working, they still don't stop. Like you said, that work ethic's really, really strong in people. And you need to just like shut it all down at some point and give them the time off to just do something else.
There's a lot of smarts in that. We are so bad, at least in this country, at just resting and investing our time in something else. It's an important thing to do from a leadership perspective. Your job right now is to go hang out with the people that you love. We don't want to see you here. One of the things I'm a nap taker, and especially now I've gotten older. And when someone would ever kind of like get a little weird, like I'm going to work 20 hours, just not in a row, or we're going to take a couple hours off. But I would say, hey, I promise there's going to be plenty of war when I get back. Like you guys aren't going to.
Right.
They're still going to be shooting at you.
Yeah. We're still going to be making jelly on Monday morning. Everything's going to be fine. If you're not here for 5 minutes, it's going to be fine. Go rest, go be the best version of you, somewhere else. It's hard to get people to believe in that though. I mean, closing the office, okay, great, but also don't access your email or whatever it's going to be. How do you enforce that in someone who's a leader who needs convincing? How do you enforce that lesson for them so they see it?
Well, I'm the worst person. So all the people who are listening right now that work for me go, well, she never stops. It used to be, I got to be honest with you. It used to be that I get on a cross-country flight or a flight to another country, and I was so happy that no one could contact me. Now that they put Wi-Fi on those airplanes, I'm really less happy about it. I'm just like, well, do I sign up or do I not sign up? How much was that Wi-Fi? Oh, it was $35. Not going to do that one. Oh, it's only $8. Should I sign up? It's hard. I like to bike. My husband and I got bikes. And so for us, if we can get on the bike and we do, a long trip on a bike, then nobody can find us. And you almost have to physically separate yourself from the device to sometimes be able to stop. And look, we're all trying to make things work. And it's hard right now. I mean, we know what burdens people are carrying, and it's a very difficult time. And so taking that time, whether it's swimming, I'm big into athletics. If you're a swimmer, just go swim 50 laps. If you're a biker, just go bike. Go do something that's different and that's physically rejuvenating, or go take a nap. I can't take naps. I wish I could.
It's interesting that you bring that up about bicycling. My wife and I are backpackers, and we very much love the aspect of backpacking where you're not too deep into the trail before you run out of cell signal. And for us, that's a feature. It's not a bug. But we were backpackers when we were dating and engaged. And it's funny how now in 2021, we celebrated our 27th wedding anniversary last week. And in 2021, we consider it such a positive good that we're out of cell signal. Whereas when we were in college together backpacking with our InterVarsity Fellowship Bible study group, that was just a given. I mean, there was no cell signal. I mean, this wasn't even an issue. We have to be deliberate about it now.
We do. We have to teach our kids how to solve problems too. Yeah. I mean, look, my sister and I lived in Taiwan during the late 80s, and my sister did this trip around the world. We couldn't reach our parents and they couldn't reach us. she had all sorts of things happen. She broke her leg, she broke her collarbone, she got shingles. She had to figure it out. She had to figure it out in Africa and India and Hong Kong and Thailand. I've told her she should write a book just about all the medical problems that she ran into.
She should.
But you have to figure it out too. It makes you solve the problem. The hardest thing we have right now is that, if my daughter has a flat tire, she calls me. I'm like, call AAA. Call AAA. They can help fix that. What do you want me to do? I can't tell you what to do. So I think it's that disconnecting for all of us. And it's worrisome because we do become so tethered that it's hard to relax. And it's also hard to figure out our way out of the box. And we need to figure it out sometimes.
So you can answer a question for me. My perception is that there is a paucity of critical thinking and problem solving in the younger generations. Do you think that's accurate, or is this me approaching my 50th birthday and turning into a grumpy old man who is yelling, "Get off my lawn"?
Well, they can figure out the
both.
technology. Maybe it's better of both. I mean, they can figure out the technology much better than we can, but I do think there is a tendency where they contact their parents far earlier than we would have, or that we could have. I mean, if you can't call your parents, which I couldn't do in 1989 in Taiwan, during a typhoon, I just had to figure out what to do. Go to the top floor. That's actually what we figured out. And don't go outside. But they could figure out other things. I mean, what I've discovered is my daughter's really good mechanically. She's really good at fixing stuff. She's really good at building stuff. They have their own things that they're doing, but their ability to call us during an emergency or crisis may not be the most positive thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on wisdom. We have so much access to so much information. If you're having trouble working on your car, you just pull up YouTube and the answer is right there. But the wisdom is just kind of the one word we say, and then we're done. But I think that there's subsets within wisdom. You can have too many wise people in the room. You can have a glut of wisdom. You can have a paucity of wisdom. You have these things where wisdom it's situational, and it can be really rare, and it's hard to quantify and hard to stack up and you make as a resource, I think.
And, you learn it over time. It's not something like you're just born brilliant. And I've spent a lot of time in Asia. And so, that the way sort of the Confucius studies process worked is there was that element of brilliance, but then there was that element of having to solve problems and really think about the interconnection points between things. And, my favorite story in the Bible was always Solomon. I just, I was like, that was my favorite story. But here is an individual who had great wisdom, yet made many mistakes. People are people, they're humans. They have the ability to have learned from their experience. And, some societies give a lot more credit to older people than we do because of the wisdom that they've gained just through the experiences that they've had. And, maybe we don't give as much credit to the wise soul as we used to and as we should.
Even if it's simply, hey, I made this body of mistakes. Don't do this.
Right.
I mean, even that is a level of wisdom. I grew up in rural South Carolina, and there were plenty of people in my extended family that on the face of it, you probably wouldn't consider them wise people, but they could tell you what not to do in life.
And you still did it. You still did it.
Still did some of them. Still did some of them for sure. We got probably about 10-ish minutes left, Lisa. Talk to us about the process of writing the book. Did you enjoy writing it? There's got to be a level of satisfaction in seeing it out there.
There is, but it's a longer process than people tell you. I'm a very quick writer. And so I wrote the book for 6 months, well, actually 5 months, from Labor Day until December 31st of 2020. And I would wake up at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning. I did it on Saturdays and Sundays, 7 o'clock a.m. until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And nobody was allowed to bother me, but it was just my husband and I on our farm. So who was bothering me? It was during COVID. There wasn't anything going on. If I wanted to attend church, I could just watch the church service at 5 o'clock at night. So I would get up at 7 and I would write straight through that time period. And I had an amazing editor. And it's funny, I've had a lot of people tell me they're writing a book. I'm like, do you have a good editor? Oh, I don't need an editor. I'm like, yes, you do. My editor,
Yes.
I didn't like her sometimes. We met from 6:30 to 9:30 on Wednesday nights. And so I'd send it to her. She's like, nope, 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 can't do this. She didn't edit the book. She didn't go through and redline the book. What she did is she taught me how to write a book. I felt like I was going through a graduate course. And
Wow.
I was talking to a professor, and she would just do comments. This sentence doesn't make sense. And I'd be like, well, do you want to offer up a suggestion? Is that what you're supposed to do?
Right.
She's like, no, go figure it out yourself. The sentence doesn't make sense, Lisa. If you say this, this, and this, how does that sentence make sense? Well, then I had to go back and do a lot of rewriting. And so she made me do the rewriting, and she made me write out an outline. I'd already started writing the book. None of it was good enough. I had to do an outline. So that is the process. It's a long and arduous process. And, you truly think that you cannot do it sometimes. Maybe I'm not smart enough to do it. Maybe I don't have the talent to do it. But like anything in life, you go and you do the homework. And so she'd send me back. I'd go do the homework. I'd rewrite the thing. I'd cancel out paragraphs that I loved that she said made no sense. She told me that I should look at reordering things. I'm like, again, do you want to give me a hint? What should go first and what should go second? She's like, no. So having that coach through the process was really critically important to me. And then I worked with a team of people that are in their 20s to market the book. And again, talk about the fact that I know less than I'm in my late 50s, people 30 years younger than I am. They could be my children. I'm having to lean heavily on them to explain book marketing to me because I had all these assumptions and they were all wrong, just flat out wrong.
Did you enjoy that process of kind of learning the marketing aspect of it, the publishing aspect of it, things that weren't necessarily part of your world?
Oh, absolutely. I love learning new things. I love learning new things. Like, it's boring for me to go do something I've done before. It's one reason I didn't stay on a career path where I just rose through a particular industry, because I always have to be learning and trying and figuring it out. And so, learning, it's not about book tours anymore. It's all about digital marketing. That's how you sell your books. It's all about making sure that you have a spread across multiple different bookstores. It can't all be Amazon. Learning that you will do an early bird special, which we did in order to get more people to buy the books, that people would be talking about it. It's not standing up, and even politics today, it's not standing up in a room of 20 people. It's only 20 voters. It's only 20 book buyers. It's really about how many people do you touch. And so we're all evolving. And the book process was just yet another example of that evolutionary learning experience.
Yeah, it's good.
So what's the next book?
So the next book is going to be on leadership and character. And what I want to do after I'm retiring in the spring from my job as a CEO and talking to academic institutions. And what I'm very passionate about is leadership and character. I've mentored a lot of people. I've helped people at the beginning of their career. I've helped people in the middle of their career. And I've actually helped a lot of people at the end of their career when they're realizing that they're only 60 years old. They've perhaps made their money. They want to do something. What else can they do that will really make a difference? And so what's the characteristics that you need to have at those different moments and times? What is true leadership? And I talk a lot about, we live in the greatest democracy. We live in the greatest democracy. And there is nothing prohibiting any of us from picking up the mantle of leadership and helping to solve a problem in our neighborhood, in our community, in our state, or at the national level. It is literally leaning into it. We saw that with truck drivers and grocery store workers and physician's assistants and nurses throughout the pandemic. We saw that with school teachers. We saw that with just such a wide variety. And so what I want to do is encourage people to not be discouraged. Bad things happen. They happen. We can't keep them from happening. But what we can do is that we can gather together and break through and get something even better. Do what my dad said, challenge your crisis, recognize our biggest stumbling block. Our biggest stumbling block is COVID and all of our responses to it, no matter where you are in the political spectrum. But the reality is we can challenge it, and that could actually be what makes us great again. And so I want to be focused on that.
It is such a high commendation of your book Turnaround that we're talking about a leadership book and turning around troubled organizations. And some of the key words in our discussion are empathy, humility, wisdom, and now character. I think that just really speaks to what you've done with this book, that those are the key pivot points in our conversation that we're discussing. How would you define character? What does that look like?
I talk about character in the book is when we're talking about an institution, it's being the steward of the institution. We are a temporary steward in life. We are. Life doesn't last forever. Institutions go on by when we leave. If you see yourself as a temporary steward of whatever you're involved with, what you recognize is that you need to leave a deliverable at every step of the way, because that speaks to the impact on the world around you, the impact that you have had. At that moment of your death, what are they going to say about you? And what's actually going to be considered important or not important? Are they even going to know who you are? I love the movie It's a Wonderful Life, because Jimmy Stewart learns that just by being who he was, that he had such a huge impact on people. And so for me, character is recognizing your role. We each have a temporary role on this planet. What's your role, and how are you going to treat other people, and what are you going to accomplish in the moments that you've been given and the opportunities that you have?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm a theologian, so I'm legally obligated to ask. Talk to us just for a brief moment about the role of faith in your leadership. What have you drawn from the Christian tradition that made you such a capable, empathetic, humble leader?
I read the Bible, and what the Bible shows you is it shows you that every great leader had flaws. Every great leader had flaws. Simon Peter had flaws. St. Paul had flaws. He wasn't a nice person. No one liked him very much.
Right.
King David, who is the sort of pinnacle, had really serious flaws. I think one of the things we learn in the religious process is not only faith and having faith that you can pray and that things will work out, or that things will be done in the way that God wants them to be. So you may have to resolve yourself to a path that you really don't like very much, but it is the path that you have. But secondarily is every single person in that book is flawed. They're not perfect. And then the question is, what did they do at that moment in time? And that's really what I go back to.
One of my favorite moments in the scriptures is when God calls Jeremiah, and Jeremiah says, no, I'm not your guy. I'm too young. I'm a poor speaker. I have zero experience, and I'm clinically depressed. And God goes, yeah, whatever. To your point, that there's no perfect person, there's no perfect leader, there's no perfect leadership, and there's a certain amount of grace in that.
There's a great deal of grace in it. We don't have to be perfect. I talk a lot about my writings. Stop the self-flagellation. Just stop it. We all make mistakes, and what you can do is you can beat yourself up constantly for a mistake that you made, or for a judgment call that you made that didn't turn out to be the right one. And either you can just sit and beat yourself up, or you can learn from it and make a decision about how you can react to it later. And that is something I got from my parents. I was a straight A student. And if I had a bad semester at UVA, and I was devastated. And my parents are like, you can't be perfect. You're not perfect. You can't always be the smartest kid. You can't, it doesn't matter. But I said, well, I tried and I wanted to, and I knew that it's my job to do my best. And my dad said, sometimes your best isn't the A. It just isn't. And learning that was a really important lesson to learn in life.
I'm going to take a moment here to kind of wrap things up. So the first thing I want to say is everybody should get Lisa's book. There's a link there for Amazon on the page that will also be in the show notes if you guys want to get it. The book is called Turnaround: How to Change Course When Things Are Going South. I think it's fascinating. It's interesting. It's always like there's all these ways to do this. And people talk about these topics, but I think how you're presenting it with your experience, it's a really, really powerful book. On a personal note, I'm letting everybody know through the show that my brother passed away last week. We're trying to get the family stabilized and going forward. And so what we're asking is, in addition to thoughts and prayers and condolences, is if you're able to contribute to their GoFundMe, the link is going across the bottom of the page. You can also go to any of my social media accounts, send me a note, send me an email, send me a text. I'll send you the link to that. That is the best way to help. I'm gonna get them going in the right direction. They're gonna also be able to get themselves going. But that's what my brother would want. That's what I need. That's the help I need. So if you guys are into that, GoFundMe. That's the best place to go and help us. And I'm going to turn it back over to you guys. Todd, any final questions? Any last words? Lisa, thank you so much.
Listen, I could talk for another 2 hours to you about this stuff, Lisa. I mean, this is really deep, substantive stuff, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. Is there anything that you want us to know about the book that we didn't cover in the past time together? Is there something we should have mentioned, or something that you want to say?
Well, I appreciate your asking. And first, Pete, I'm so sorry to hear about your brother because that is such a huge loss, losing a sibling and one that you're particularly close to. All I would say is it doesn't matter what stage you are at life. I've tried to write the book in a way that if you're the CEO of a company or if you're just starting out your career, that there's something in there for you. I found out my daughter was skipping around to different chapters and she goes, well, Mom, I just wanted to find the stuff that would help me right now. And so what I hope I've done is that I've provided each and every one of you with answers to the stuff that you're trying to deal with right now.
My parting shot is that I wouldn't limit the readership to people who want to turn around a troubled organization. One of the things that I mentioned in my review is that if you read the book now and implement some of what Lisa's saying, maybe you don't end up in a place where you need some of these lessons when your organization is troubled. So there's a lot of great stuff. I hope people take advantage of it. I really do.